A jihadist is an Islamic activist who would like to replace the secular states that exist in the Muslim world today with states based on the Islamic Sharia or Islamic law. The only problem with this particular, project is that they would like to use all means at their disposal, including violence and terrorism, in order to bring about their utopian kingdom on earth. But remember, Dennis, we're talking about a tiny group. We're talking about thousands, not tens of thousands or millions of activists. So in this particular sense, it's a very limited phenomenon.
Right. So it's limited, but it can do real damage if not at least controlled, etc. Now we're in the middle of something called the war on terror, which many of us don't even like the word war on terror. We interviewed one of the commissioners for the 9/11 Commission, and he said, what we're really at war at, we're at war with Islamic fanatic Islamist militarism. I'm not sure exactly how he said it, but basically jihadists is who we're really at war with, as opposed to being a war on terror, which is just a tactic. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think you might say why language is important, Dennis. Why do we, because it's very important, because what we need to understand, we are facing a limited group of militants, of terrorists, of extremists, what I call jihadists, in particular the Al-Qaeda wing, who basically perpetrated a heinous crime against America on 9/11. And I don't think you want to lend them any legitimacy. You don't want to play into their hands by declaring an all-out war against a very tiny fringe. And this fringe, as you said, it's very dangerous. It is highly dangerous. They have killed tens of thousands of Muslims, they have killed thousands of Americans, but what we need to understand, this is a war against a tiny fringe of Islamist militants or jihadists who basically manipulate and distort Islam in order to garner political support at home.
Okay, my philosophy always has been, and it doesn't matter if we're talking on this program about business issues, economic issues, political issues, military issues, social issues, cultural issues, etc., is that when you have an issue that has a problem, however you'd like to find what the problem is, the first thing you do is kind of try to find what the problem is, but the second thing that I always look for is what caused this problem. And so I'd like for you to give us a little bit of a background as to how this movement came about, sort of what its philosophical underpinnings are, if you will.
This is really a great question, because I think from its birth in the mid-1970s, jihadism was born in the mid-1970s in Egyptian universities. Jihadism was not born in the ghettos or the poverty belts of Muslim cities. It was born in the universities. It's a social movement. And since its birth in the 1970s until the late 1990s, the major goal of jihadism was on what I call the near enemy. The near enemy meaning local Arab and Muslim governments. They wanted to topple the existing Arab and Muslim governments and replace them with Islamic states. From its birth in the mid-1970s until the late 1990s, the focus was on the home front, not on the far enemy, the United States and its allies. And the question to me, you asked me earlier, why were you interested in this particular question? The question to me, why did the jihadists in the late 1990s decided to shift gears from local Arab and Muslim governments into the far enemy, the United States and its Western allies? This is really the question that preoccupied me in the last 7 or 8 years. I wanted to understand why jihadists turned their guns against the United States of America. And I think there are 3 reasons why jihadists decided to target the United States in the late 1990s.
Good. I don't know about you and that viewer, but we're all ears, so tell us.
The first question, Dennis, is that jihadists, those activists who wanted to topple the existing secular governments and establish Islamic states, were defeated on their home front in the late 1990s. In Egypt, in Algeria, the backbone of the jihadist movement was basically broken by the existing governments. The second reason, as you know, the Afghanistan War from 1979 to 1989 created a major contingent of activists, of fighters, of the so-called Afghan Arabs, who felt empowered, emboldened by the victory over the evil empire being the Soviet Union. And remember, throughout the 1980s, we, the United States, and the jihadists were on the same, the same trenches. We were fighting the evil empire. But the jihadists said to themselves, look, if we can defeat the Soviet Union, the greatest military force in the world, surely we can take on the United States of America. America did not have the stomach for a prolonged fight. They really believed that the Afghan war empowered them and emboldened them. They could really take on the United States. And the final reason, the third reason, in fact, I would say this is the most important reason, the United States intervention in the 1990-1991 Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we sent 500,000 soldiers into Kuwait. We expelled the Iraqi army from Kuwait, and we decided to permanently station troops in Saudi Arabia. The stationing of American troops in Saudi Arabia was the catalyst that turned Osama bin Laden, who is himself from that part of the world, from Saudi Arabia, and his contingent against the United States of America. That was really the catalyst, that was the critical factor that brought about the clash between the Osama bin Laden contingent and the far enemy, that's the United States of America.
Well, it's an interesting and a very concise way of putting it, and I appreciate your doing that. I want to take you back to some conversations you had with a guy named Kamal, who in your book. And I want to set the stage by telling you where I was in October of 1981. That happened to be a night I will never forget. I was in Lyon, France, in a pizza restaurant, drinking red wine and eating pizza. It was a great night, but there was a radio, maybe even a television on somewhere in the restaurant. And it was obviously in French, and there are a lot of people who say I don't speak English very well, and I don't speak French at all. But I kept hearing something about Sadat, and I thought, something bad has happened here. Tell us what happened there, and then tie it into one of the guys you interviewed in this book.
The book, Journey of the Jihadist, is based on hundreds of interviews I've done with the rank and file of the militants, the jihadists. And Kamal al-Sa'id al-Habib was one of the pioneers, the founding fathers of the jihadist movement in the mid-1970s in Egyptian universities. He was a student at Cairo University. And I profiled Kamal in this particular book. I followed his journey over 6 or 7 months in Egypt. And the reason why your question is very critical, because the point I made earlier for our American audience is that the major goal, the major focus of the jihadist movement was at their home front, their own governments. In fact, the first shot in the jihadist war was not against the United States in 1981, it was against the most important president in that part of the world, Anwar Sadat, the late Egyptian president. They killed Anwar Sadat in 1981. They basically shot the first bullet in the war against the near enemy, and this is really how it all began. It began in 1981. Kamal told me they not only hoped to kill Anwar Sadat, they hoped to overthrow the secular system established by Sadat and his predecessors and replace Anwar Sadat with an Islamic state based on the Islamic Sharia.
Okay. I want to take you then back one step further. 1928 was an interesting year. There was a group that had its genesis in 1928, again, in Egypt. And I believe you even interviewed the brother of the founder, if I'm not mistaken. So tell us who the founder was, tell us what the organization was, and then how intellectually, through Mr. Qutb and others, this organization has, in some ways, been, it seems to me, sort of the philosophical underpinnings of this movement in some ways.
Again, another great question, because the Islamist movement is a huge movement. It encompasses all kinds of mainstream, liberal, enlightened, radical, and militants. And the jihadist movement is a tiny fringe within the Islamist movement. The Islamist movement represents about 30%. If you have free elections in the Muslim world today, the Islamist movement would garner about 30% of the electoral vote.
And this is the group who would want to do it in peaceful means,
Absolutely.
By some sort of a democratic process, etc.
Absolutely. The Islamist movement, the Muslim Brotherhood that was established, you referred to the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Brothers, were established in 1928. The Muslim Brotherhood is the most powerful Islamist political organization that exists not only in Egypt, in many Arab and Muslim countries, and I would say they would garner about 30% of the electoral vote if elections were to take place. Unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood used violence and terrorism in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, even though they renounced the use of violence in the early 1970s. Now they have accepted the rules of the game. Out of this particular movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, emerged a man called Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is considered then as what I call the spiritual founding father of the jihadist movement. Sayyid Qutb provided the theoretical and the spiritual legitimacy for the jihadists in order to take arms not only against the far enemy, in particular against the near enemy, because what Sayyid Qutb, this philosopher of what I call militancy, believed that the existing government in the Muslim world were not Islamic. The existing government were not authentically Islamic. Not only that, Sayyid Qutb then has argued that even Muslim societies were no longer Islamic.
Mm-hmm. And part of the problem he had, I believe, is that he saw governments and societies, cultures, becoming more westernized,
Absolutely.
As an example. And then, of course, I remember the great time, I think he came here in 1948 and spent some time in Greeley, Colorado.
2 years.
2 years here.
And in fact, his presence in the United States radicalized the man. Really, before 1948, he was a poet, he was a writer, he was a literary critic. But his presence in the United States, I mean, look at the irony. He was sent to the United States to learn about the educational system in the United States. Because he found America too decadent, too secular. He found America, the relationship between religion and politics, it's a separate, relatively separate system. He went back very angry. He went back, and so by saying that the Islamic governments were not Islamic, by saying that Muslim societies were not Islamic, he excommunicated both Muslim governments and Muslim societies. He provided the ammunition, the theoretical ammunition, the religious ammunition for young men to take arms, not only against their governments, but also against their societies.
Yeah. Well, I'm fascinated by what he found in America, because one of the big themes that he found, other than obviously the difference of secularization, was the sexual nature of women and men in America. And this is 1948. Now, if that person watching this program, can you imagine? Now, if he had survived, which he didn't, he got hanged, I think, in 1966, wasn't it?
Yes.
In prison in Egypt. But can you imagine if he were sitting here today watching MTV, watching VH1, watching all of going to California with the porno capital of the world and the internet? Can you imagine what he would think today?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I have a chapter on Sayyid Qutb in the book Journey of the Jihadist. I call it the Great Satan near and far. The Great Satan being both Islamic governments, Muslim governments, and the United States itself. His sensibilities were shocked by the American value system. He could not believe how the church itself would serve as a sacred place for prayers and a place for dance. I mean, on the weekends.
Yes.
He could not understand.
He obviously did not go to a Baptist church when he was here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And I think I mean, also for the historical record, he was not just shocked by you might say, the value system that exists in America. He was also very angry at the American foreign policy that played a pivotal role in the creation of Israel. What happened in 1948, as you know, Dennis, was the UN resolution that basically partitioned historical Palestine into two states, one Palestinian and one Jewish. He believed that the United States played a pivotal role in supporting the existence of a Jewish state in the heart of the Arab world. That particular issue, Dennis, really was a critical factor in driving Sayyid Qutb from the moderate camp into the Islamic and militant camp.
And in fact, I think you say in the book that he was already upset with the United States because of Truman and immediately the U.S. recognizing the government there before he even got on the plane to come here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this really brings us to the heart of the question. I think what we need to understand why jihadists loathe America the way they do. Of course, one element is the cultural factor. that they basically resent American secularism, they resent the value system, that the equality between man and woman, they resent the separation of religion and government. But at the same time, Dennis, I would be misleading you if I say that foreign policy is not a pivotal issue in the reason why jihadists turned against America, in particular the Palestine issue. We come back, really we go back, we talk about politics inside the Muslim world, relations between the United States and the Muslim world. The Palestine-Israeli conflict from its establishment in 1948 remains the most fundamental issue. The poison that poison relations between Americans and the Muslim community.
Okay, let me take you through, he wrote a couple of books. He was executed in 1966. Egypt became not what he wanted. It became secular and Arab as opposed to Islamic and more, let's just say, religious oriented.
Yes.
And so he didn't like that. He was in jail. He wrote these books, Milestones and In the Shade of the Quran, I think. So a lot of his folks in the Muslim Brotherhood then were run out of Egypt, and many of those ended up in another country called Saudi Arabia. Tell us how that worked, and then tell us who Mr. Wahhab was and how we got this idea of what so-called Wahhabi Islam is.
Sayyid Qutb, the spiritual philosopher of militants or jihadists, was, as you said, was hanged in 1966. And guess what? The first jihadist cell was established in 1967 in the Arab world in Egypt. And guess who established the first jihadist cell? Was Ayman al-Zawahiri, the second man in Al-Qaeda, the right-hand man of Osama bin Laden. I mean, look at the relationship. The hanging of Sayyid Qutb and the establishment of the first jihadist cell in the Arab world by Ayman Zawahiri, who declared war on America in the late 1990s. And you see how oppression in the Muslim world itself played a critical part in the rise of this particular jihadist movement. Ayman Zawahiri, in his memoirs, he argues that the hanging of Sayyid Qutb provided him with the inspiration to take revenge against the Egyptian government. And as you said, in the 1970s, and 1960s, and 1950s, a major war took place in the Muslim world. Many of the Islamists left Egypt into Saudi Arabia. And what's important about that? Why the migration of the Muslim brothers, people from Egypt in Saudi Arabia? There was a fertilization between the Muslim Brotherhood and the so-called the ideology of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And even Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda himself, was educated by scholars and clerics who belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. The brother of Sayyid Qutb himself, Muhammad Qutb, was the teacher of Osama bin Laden. Look at the irony.
It's amazing.
Muhammad Qutb, who left Egypt after his brother was hanged and he himself spent a few years in prison, went in Saudi Arabia. He became a teacher in Saudi Arabia. He taught a generation of Wahhabi Saudis. He taught them the ideology of Sayyid Qutb and the militancy. Osama bin Laden himself is what I call represents a marriage between Wahhabism, a highly conservative ideology in Saudi Arabia, and the ideology of Sayyid Qutb. And what you have is jihadism that is Al-Qaeda, which perpetrated a major crime against the Muslim community and the international community and the American community.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, and I want to now take you to events that happened in 1979. We've alluded to it a little bit before, but the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the former Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden obviously ended up in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen fighters in that time, and you said that they figured out they could beat the Soviet Union, they ought to be able to beat the United States, which is what happened. What culpability, if any, do we have as a country for what we did or did not do in Afghanistan in the 80s?
Well, really, thank you for another great question. I mean, I think I wrote a book on the relationship between the United States and Islamists, Islamic activists who would like to establish states based on Islamic law, called America and Political Islam, Clash of Cultures or Clash of Religions. It was published in 2000. And the reason why this is a very important question, Dennis, is that now many Americans believe that our hardened enemies, our worst enemies are the Islamists. How many Americans know that we, the United States of America, was in the same trenches as the Islamists from the 1940s up to the late 1980s. The Islamists, the militant Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters, and the United States were in the same trenches. And why, Dennis? Because we were fighting socialism and Marxism and the evil empire. The evil empire, the Soviet Union, which invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And between 1979 and 1989, almost 10 years, the United States and Saudi Arabia provided about $12 billion in aid for the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters, and the jihadists. And Osama bin Laden, Dennis, was what I call the middleman between Saudi Arabia, he came from Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, which was supported by the United States. And what does this tell you? This tells you that we need to understand American foreign policy. And this is not just about, you say that the jihadists attacked America because they hate our values and our democracy and because we are a successful nation. There is a history, and we need to understand the history. And why did the United States of America ally itself with Islamists between the late 1940s and the late 1980s? There's a history which is not very pleasant, as you know. It's full of contradictions. It's full of complexities. It's full of tensions.
It is, but it's something that person watching this program needs to know if they're going to understand these issues going forward. Now, in the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have, last night on the program, you also had a guy named Steve Emerson who was there with you, and Reza Aslan was there too. But Steve Emerson has talked a lot about jihadists in America. Give us your sense of what, if any, cells are in this country today that might lead to, let's just say now, almost homegrown terrorism.
Dennis, the FBI has done a systemic investigation since 9/11. So far, what the FBI has said, what we know is that we are very fortunate. We are very fortunate because the United States does not suffer from the same problems as some of the European countries do. And Stephen Emerson, unfortunately, has this particular, he is obsessed with certain mosques in America, with certain religious clerics in America. He has been, as you know, on a mission in order to track and see whether there are any jihadists or any cells in the United States.
We shouldn't say he's been on a crusade, should we?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to know if we need to use that word here.
Really,
right?
I use the term mission, but he is extremely emphatic. And he's on a crusade to prove that there are militant elements in the United States. I want to say 2 things here. That the Muslim American community, which numbers about between 5 and 6 million people, is a fully integrated community in the United States, is one of the most growing communities, one of the most successful community, and this is a testament to the American dream, that the United States, unlike other countries, has been able to integrate other communities very easily. In fact, I am one of those people, I am not a Muslim, as you know, but I am one of those people who believe that we in the United States, we should not only integrate and help integrate the Muslim community, we should use the Muslim community as the first line of defense against militancy and jihadism. Instead of trying to label and brand the Muslim community in positive terms, we should really co-opt the Muslim community and have it be the first line of defense against militancy and jihadism. And unlike Europe, we don't have a homegrown terrorist militancy in the United States. This is really, it tells you a great deal, not only about the Muslim community, about America itself. The American model now really has been able throughout the ages to integrate other communities, including the Muslim community, one of the most successful and prosperous and growing communities in the United States.
In fact, I think you had some statistics, economic statistics. You can share those with our viewers.
Absolutely. I'm sure many Americans have Muslim neighbors. The median income of a Muslim community is about $53,000 a year, which is higher than most communities, including white Americans. $53,000 a year. Tens of thousands of doctors, of engineers. I mean, this is a prosperous community. It's a fully integrated community. It really tells you it's integrated not just into the economic, but into the social fabric of America. And I think the challenge facing all of us as non-Muslims in America, how do we not only stop looking and stop, in fact, having any suspicions, looking in suspicious eyes, vis-a-vis this community, having what I call an inclusive framework, that not only we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, because I think Muslims are part of the social fabric of the international community, the Judeo-Christian community today.
Well, it does seem as if we're able to do that. The better we are able to do that, the less likely we are to have jihadists among our midst. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, but my interest, Dennis, really, I don't look at the Muslim community because just it fights militancy. I think it's the future of the Muslim community itself is invested in fighting militancy and extremism. It's in their own interest and our interest and the international community as well.
Yeah, I appreciate what you do and how you're trying to share the message and the research that you've done in visiting with these people there, and I appreciate your visiting with us, and I appreciate your joining us because, as always, we've been talking about things that matter with people who care.